was standing on the platform of the 42nd Street subway station, and the air was so thick with the smell of wet pavement, ozone, and burnt coffee that I could almost chew it. My designer coat, a beige wool blend that had cost $1,200 and used to symbolize my success, was stained with a dark, oily smudge from a taxi door I'd bumped into. My hair was frizzing in the swampy underground humidity. My feet were throbbing in boots that were never meant for miles of concrete, and my bank account was a series of angry red numbers screaming at me from my phone's screen. The Q train pulled in with a screech that set my teeth on edge, a sound so violent and abrasive it should have made me flinch. But I didn't. I leaned toward it. I looked at my reflection in the grime-streaked window as the train slowed down, and for the first time in 3 years, I didn't see a ghost. I saw a woman whose eyes were finally, terrifyingly awake. I started to laugh. It wasn't a pretty laugh. It was a jagged, hysterical sound that got lost in the roar of the tunnel. People moved away from me. They thought I was just another crazy New Yorker. And that was the greatest compliment I had ever received. Because 3 years ago, in the absolute, terrifying silence of my perfect, suburban home, I had sat in a bathtub for 4 hours wondering if anyone would notice if I just stopped breathing. I had traded my porcelain fortress for a beautiful, chaotic mess, and I knew right then I was finally alive. The house was located at the end of a cul-de-sac in a development called Willow Creek, though there were no willows and certainly no creek. It was a craftsman-style home with a wraparound porch and windows so clean they looked like they weren't even there. That was the first irony of my life. Everything was designed to be transparent, yet I was hiding the biggest secret in the world. David and I had been married for 12 years. If you asked our neighbors, the Millers, they would tell you we were the anchor of the block. David was a senior architect, a man who measured his life in precise millimeters. He was kind. That's the word everyone used. David is so kind, Sophia, you're so lucky. And I was. He never forgot an anniversary. He never raised his voice. He folded his laundry into perfect, sharp-edged rectangles that looked like soldiers lined up in his dresser. He liked his life like he liked his blueprints. Clean lines, no unexpected curves, and a solid foundation. Every morning at 6:30 a.m., the house would begin its silent, mechanical dance. I would wake up before the alarm, staring at the ceiling fan spinning with a faint, rhythmic tick-tick-tick. The programmable coffee maker downstairs would hiss and gurgle, filling the house with the scent of expensive, fair-trade beans. The heated floors in the primary bathroom would warm up to exactly 74 degrees. I would stand there, naked and shivering despite the warmth, looking at my face in the anti-fog mirror. I would begin the ritual of becoming Sophia. I'd apply the serum that cost more than a week's worth of groceries, then the moisturizer, the primer, the foundation, layers upon layers of expensive liquids designed to blur the fact that I was 37 and felt like I was evaporating. I'd watch my hands as I applied my mascara. They were steady, but inside, my bones felt like they were made of glass. "Coffee's ready, Soph," David would call from the hallway. His voice was always the same, steady, morning-soft, utterly predictable. "Coming, David," I'd say, my voice a perfect replica of a happy wife. I remember one specific Saturday. We were hosting a dinner party for the partners at David's firm. I had spent the entire day preparing a beef bourguignon, the kind of meal that requires you to sear the meat in batches until your kitchen smells like a French bistro. I was wearing a silk blouse the color of a winter sky, expensive, delicate, and entirely impractical. As the guests arrived, men in quarter zips and women with perfectly blown-out hair that didn't move when they laughed, I realized I was observing the scene from about 10 feet above my own body. I watched myself pour the wine, a heavy Cabernet that left purple stains on the rims of the glasses. I watched myself laugh at a joke about interest rates in school districts. "The crown molding in here is exquisite, David," one of the partners, a man named Jim, said while gesturing to the ceiling I had spent 6 months choosing. "You really caught the light with those windows." "Sophia has a great eye for detail," David replied, reaching over to squeeze my hand. His hand was warm. It was safe. But as his fingers brushed mine, I felt a jolt of pure, unadulterated panic. It was the feeling of being trapped under a sheet of thick ice. You can see the sun, you can see the people walking above you, you can even hear their muffled voices, but you can't make a sound. I looked around my dining room. At the mid-century modern sideboard, the hand-blown wine glasses that felt too fragile to hold, the organic cotton napkins that had been ironed into submission, and I realized that every single object in this room was a weight holding me underwater. I walked into the kitchen to get the dessert, a lemon tart with a crust that crumbled perfectly under a silver fork. I stood by the sink, the noise of the party muffled by the heavy, soundproof oak door, and I just stared at the backsplash. The tiles were a soft, subway gray. They were perfect, and I hated them. I hated them with a vehemence that made my stomach turn. I wanted to take a hammer to them. I wanted to scream until the windows shattered and the neighbors called the police. I wanted someone to acknowledge that the silence in this house was actually a roar. Instead, I picked up the tart, put on the Sophia smile, and walked back out. Everything is just so peaceful here, Jim's wife sighed, taking a bite of the lemon tart. I don't know how you do it, Sophia. Your life is just seamless. Seamless, that was the word. There were no edges to grab onto, no friction to tell me where I ended and the house began. We were living in a catalog, and I was the model whose only job was to look comfortable. That night after the guests had gone, David and I stood in the kitchen. We didn't even have to speak. We moved in a synchronized domestic ballet. He rinsed the plates, I loaded the dishwasher. Scrape, rinse, click. Scrape, rinse, click. Great night, Soph, he said, kissing my temple. He smelled like red wine and expensive soap. The tart was a hit. Jim was really impressed with the house. Thanks, David, I whispered. My throat felt like it was lined with sandpaper. I went to bed and laid perfectly still on my side of the king-sized mattress, listening to the silence of the suburbs. It wasn't the silence of rest. It was the silence of a vacuum. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, a frantic, thumping sound that seemed to be saying, "Run, run, run." I looked at the dark silhouette of the walk-in closet, where my rows of blouses hung like colorful ghosts. I realized then that I wasn't living a life, I was maintaining an asset. And the most terrifying thought of all crawled into my brain and took root. If this is the prize for winning the race of my 30s, why does it feel like I'm waiting for the world to end? I reached out and touched the Egyptian cotton sheets. They were cool and smooth. Everything was smooth. My life had no texture, no grit, nothing to remind me that I was a biological entity made of flesh and bone. I was just another piece of the furniture. You okay, Soph? David asked, his voice muffled by his pillow. Just thinking about the guest list for the Christmas party, I lied. Go to sleep, he murmured. We have a big day tomorrow. The landscaping crew is coming at 8. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine the lawn being torn up, the dirt being turned over, anything being messy. But I knew that by noon, the grass would be a perfect, seamless green again. I laid there until the sun came up, watching the light slowly reveal the perfect, porcelain walls of my prison. The transition into what I call the Beige Period wasn't a sudden drop off a cliff. It was a slow, agonizing leak. It was the color of a rainy Tuesday in November when the sky never quite decides to be light or dark. For 3 years, from the time I turned 37 until that cold morning at 40, I existed in a state of functional depression. On the outside, the engine was still running. I never missed a mortgage payment. I never forgot to send a happy birthday text to my mother, always with the appropriate number of heart emojis. I was still the vice president of marketing at a firm that specialized in selling lifestyle dreams to people who lived exactly like me. But inside, the pilot light had gone out. I was a 3,000-square-foot house with all the lights on, but no one was home. I remember the mornings most vividly because they were the hardest part of the performance. I would wake up at 6:15 a.m. before the alarm, and I'd feel the weight of the day before it even started. It felt like a heavy, wet wool blanket was draped over my soul. I would lie there, staring at the shadows of the tree branches on the ceiling, thinking about the sequence of events I had to perform. Shower, dry hair, apply makeup, choose the professional but approachable outfit, drive to work. Smile at the assistant, sit in the 9:00 a.m. meeting. Every step felt like I was moving through waist-deep mud. I would stand in the shower under the high-pressure rainfall showerhead. the one we'd paid extra for because the brochure promised a transformative spa-like experience. And I wouldn't feel the water. I could see the steam rising. I could smell the expensive eucalyptus soap that was supposed to invigorate me, but my skin felt like it belonged to a mannequin. I was a passenger in my own body, watching a stranger wash my hair. The car became my sanctuary and my confessional. My commute was 40 minutes of winding, tree-lined suburban roads that were so beautiful they were aggressive. During those 3 years, I began a ritual that I never told David about. I would pull into the driveway after work. The garage door would slide up with its familiar mechanical hum, and I would pull the car in. But I wouldn't get out. I would turn off the engine, and the silence would rush in like water into a sinking ship. I would sit there in the dark, the steering wheel still warm beneath my hands, and I would just wait. For what? I didn't know. I'd look at the door leading into the mudroom, the portal to my perfect life, and I would feel a physical repulsion. I knew what was on the other side. David would be in the kitchen, perhaps opening a bottle of wine, the sound of the cork popping being the most exciting thing to happen all day. He'd ask, "How was your day, Soph?" And I'd have to find the words. I'd have to construct a narrative of meetings and deadlines and office politics when the only truth was that I had spent 8 hours feeling like I was being erased from a chalkboard. Sometimes I would sit there for an hour. I'd watch the digital clock on the dashboard, 6:10, 6:45, 7:15. I'd watch my breath fog up the windshield, turning the garage into a hazy, dreamlike space. I felt a profound, searing sense of guilt. "Who are you to feel this way?" I'd whisper to the rearview mirror. "You have a husband who loves you. You have a body that works. You have a bank account that is full. You are the luckiest woman in the world." But that guilt only made the fog thicker. It told me that not only was I miserable, but I was also a bad person for being miserable. I felt like I was ungrateful for the very air I was breathing. I'd look at the luxury SUV I was sitting in, with its heated leather seats and premium sound system, and I'd realize it was just a very expensive cage with excellent climate control. At work, the irony was unbearable. I spent my days crafting campaigns about finding your joy and living your best life. I sat in glass-walled conference rooms in Midtown, pitching ideas for skincare brands that promised to reveal your inner glow. My colleagues would look at me and see a powerhouse. They'd see the sharp blazer, the expensive watch, and the way I could command a room. They didn't see that I was spending my lunch breaks in a bathroom stall on the 22nd floor, counting my breaths just to make sure I was still physically there. I remember one afternoon, we were reviewing a mood board for a new wellness campaign. The images were all bright whites, soft linens, and smiling women drinking tea in sun-drenched kitchens. It was beautiful. It was aspirational. It was exactly what I had at home. "Sophia, what do you think?" the creative director asked. "Does it capture the soul of the brand?" I looked at the board, and for a second the images blurred. I saw the woman in the photo, the one in the cream-colored linen dress, and I wanted to reach into the picture and shake her. I wanted to ask her, "Are you okay? When the camera stops clicking, do you feel like you're screaming into a pillow? Does your husband know that you haven't felt a real emotion in 17 months? "It's perfect," I said, my voice steady and professional. "It's exactly what people want to see. It's the dream." Irony is a bitter pill when you're the one manufacturing it. I was selling the very dream that was killing me. By the time I reached 39, the depression had become a physical presence. It wasn't just a mood. It was a dull ache in my joints. It was a constant, low-level nausea. I stopped eating dinner. I'd tell David I'd had a big lunch at the office with a client, and I'd sit across from him at our reclaimed wood table sipping sparkling water while he ate the organic salmon I'd prepared. I was fatting away, literally and figuratively. I was becoming translucent. I started having these small, quiet breakdowns that I hid with surgical precision. I'd be folding the laundry on a Tuesday night, David's white undershirts, my silk slips, the microfiber towels, and I'd find myself weeping. No sobbing, no drama, just silent tears streaming down my face, landing on the cotton and leaving small, dark circles. I'd wipe them away with my sleeve, finish the fold, and place the shirt in the basket. I never asked for help. I couldn't. How do you ask for help when there's nothing wrong? If I had a broken leg, or a sick relative, or a financial crisis, I could have reached out. But my crisis was the absence of a crisis. My tragedy was the lack of friction. I was a person who had won the race and realized there was no trophy at the end, just a long, quiet walk into a very expensive sunset. David tried. In his own measured way, he knew something was off. He suggest a weekend getaway to a quaint inn in the Berkshires, more silence, more beige. He'd buy me a new book he thought I'd like, usually something about finding balance. He'd hold me at night, and I would lie there, stiff and cold, praying he wouldn't notice that my soul had already moved out of the house. "I feel like I'm losing you, Sophia," he said once, the room smelling of the lavender spray I used to help us sleep. I didn't answer. I couldn't, because I had already lost myself. I was 39 years old and I was waiting for the clock to run out. I didn't want to die, but I desperately, agonizingly wanted to stop being Sophia. I wanted to shed the house, the husband, the career, and the expectations like a heavy coat in a heat wave. I was at rock bottom, but because I was sitting on a velvet sofa, no one could see how far I'd fallen. The morning of my 40th birthday arrived not with a bang, but with a gray, suffocating drizzle that blurred the lines between the sky and the suburban asphalt. I woke up at 6:00 a.m., the milestone number 40 hanging over me like a heavy velvet curtain. I didn't feel older. I just felt thinner, as if the 3 years of the Beige Period had worn me down to a translucent sliver of a person. David was already awake. He was downstairs, and I could hear the familiar, rhythmic clink of a silver spoon against a porcelain bowl. He was making his oatmeal, exactly half a cup of oats, a pinch of cinnamon, 3 walnuts. The predictability of it usually comforted me, but that morning, the sound felt like a hammer hitting a raw nerve. I sat up and walked into the primary bathroom, our spa retreat. I stood in front of the vanity, looking at the array of products I used to build my mask. This was the day David had planned a surprise birthday brunch at the country club with our inner circle. The thought of it, the mimosas, the polite chatter about real estate, the "you don't look a day over 30" lies, made my throat tighten until it hurt to swallow. I reached for my foundation bottle, a heavy, frosted glass cylinder of Italian-made perfection. My hands were shaking. Not a visible tremor, but a deep, internal vibration, like a machine about to seize. As I tried to unscrew the gold cap, the bottle slipped. It happened in slow motion. The glass hit the white marble floor with a sharp, crystalline crack. The foundation, a thick, beige liquid, splattered across the tiles like a Rorschach test of my own misery. A tiny, jagged shard of glass flew up and sliced into the skin just above my ankle. I didn't move. I didn't reach for a towel. I just stood there looking at the mess. I watched a single bead of blood bloom from the cut. It was a bright, vivid, beautiful red. Against the sterile white marble and the beige puddle of makeup, that blood was the most honest thing I had seen in years. It was sharp. It was painful. It was real. "Soph, everything okay?" David's voice called from the bedroom. He walked in, still holding his spoon. He stopped when he saw the floor. "Oh, honey, don't move, you'll cut your feet." He immediately went into fixer mode. He grabbed a roll of paper towels from the cabinet. He knelt down and started dabbing at the beige sludge, careful not to touch the glass. "It's just a bottle, Sophia," he said, his voice dripping with that maddening, gentle patience. "We can get another one. Just be careful, you're going to ruin the bath mat. This rug was an investment, remember. It's hand-woven." The rug was an investment. The words hit me like a physical blow. I looked at the top of his head, his hair perfectly combed, even at 7:00 a.m., and I realized that in this room, in this house, I was just another investment. I was a piece of the set design. My pain, my blood, my 40 years on this earth were secondary to the cleanliness of a textile. The scream I had been holding in for 3 years finally reached my throat. Venemia estauatelge oya pelchova estevela puga yushte. Elya de yalanaya espelkao kratkoi esteveya. Erazeli veshaya esya pelm, oyem kao estayam. "I'm not going to the brunch, David," I said. My voice sounded like it belonged to someone else, someone much older and much more dangerous. He looked up, still kneeling on the floor, a blood and makeup-stained paper towel in his hand. "What? Everyone is coming. Your mother is driving in. It's your 40th, Soph. You're just a little shaken up by the glass. Let me get a Band-Aid." "I'm moving to New York," I said. The silence that followed was absolute. The only sound was the hum of the heated floors. "What are you talking about?" David asked, standing up slowly. He laughed, but it was a nervous, dry sound. "New York for a shopping trip. We can do that next month. Let's just get through today." "No, I'm moving. I'm leaving this house. I'm leaving the firm. I'm leaving this." I gestured to the room, the marble, the starched towels, the beige life. "I can't breathe here, David. I've been holding my breath for 3 years, and if I don't leave right now, I'm going to die. I mean it. I will simply cease to exist." "You're having a breakdown," he said, his face hardening into that reasonable man mask that I had come to loathe. "You're depressed, Sophia. We've talked about this. It's the milestone, it's the pressure. Maybe it's time for a higher dose of the medication or a different therapist. But New York, you hate the noise, you're being manic." "I don't hate the noise," I whispered, stepping over the puddle of foundation, ignoring the sting in my ankle. "I hate the silence. I hate that I can hear my own heart slowing down every time I walk through that front door. I hate that we are fine. I can't live in fine for another 40 years. The next few hours were a blurred nightmare of logical arguments. David called my mother. He called my sister, Claire. By noon, my beautiful living room, the one with the velvet sofa and the curated bookshelves, was filled with people I loved, all of whom were looking at me with a mixture of pity and horror. "You have a perfect life, Sophia," my mother cried, clutching her pearls as if they were a life raft. "David is a saint. You have a career women would kill for. Do you know what it's like out there for a woman alone? At 40, you're throwing away your security for a whim." "It's not a whim," I said, sitting on the edge of the sofa, feeling like an alien in my own skin. "It's a rescue mission." "You're being selfish," Claire snapped. "You're hurting David. You're hurting all of us because you're bored. Welcome to your 40s. We're all tired. We all want to run away sometimes. Nam yeruetao ge an yede ye elea ye em, peate am uchetao em yeru vizeros el yeru ye el udei." That was the moment I knew I was right. Because they weren't worried about my happiness. They were worried about the cracks in the facade. If I left, it meant the dream wasn't real. If I left, it meant they might have to look at their own, beige, lives and realize they were also suffocating. I didn't pack much. I took my clothes, my journals, and the small amount of money I had in a separate savings account. Money I'd hidden away almost unconsciously, like an animal sensing a hard winter. David stood in the driveway as I loaded the last bag into my car. The rain was still falling, turning his expensive wool sweater dark. He didn't yell. He didn't beg. He just looked at me with a profound, disappointed confusion. "I don't know who you are," he said quietly. "I don't either," I replied, gripping the door handle until it hurt. "That's why I have to go." As I drove out of the cul-de-sac, I looked in the rearview mirror. I saw the Craftsman house, the manicured lawn, the perfect life shrinking into a tiny point on the horizon. I felt a wave of nausea so strong I had to pull over at a gas station, but underneath the fear, there was a tiny, flickering spark. For the first time in 3 years, I didn't feel like a ghost. I was 40 years old, I had destroyed my world, and I could finally feel the cold air in my lungs. If the suburbs were a sensory deprivation tank, New York City was a high-voltage wire. I arrived in late October, just as the air was turning sharp, and the light was turning that bruised, industrial blue. The city didn't welcome me. It tolerated me. I had rented a 4th-floor walk-up in a corner of Brooklyn that smelled perpetually of roasting coffee beans, diesel exhaust, and something metallic. The scent of the elevated train that rumbled 3 blocks away, vibrating the very marrow of my bones. My apartment was a studio, which is a generous New York term for a rectangular room with a slanted floor and a kitchen that consisted of a 2-burner stove and a sink that dripped in a persistent G-flat. It was the polar opposite of Willow Creek. There were no heated floors here. Instead, there was a radiator that clanked and hissed like a dying steam engine, either providing no heat at all or turning the room into a tropical sauna at 3:00 a.m. The first night I sat on the floor. I didn't have a bed yet, just a sleeping bag I'd bought at a sporting goods store on the way into the city. I sat there in the dark, the only light coming from the orange street lamp outside my window, and listened to the sounds of my new life. In Willow Creek, the loudest sound at 11:00 p.m. was the hum of the refrigerator. Here, the world was screaming. I heard a siren blocks away, a neighbor through the thin walls shouting in a language I didn't recognize, the rhythmic thud-thud of a car with too much bass passing by, and the scratching of something. I didn't want to know what, inside the wall behind me. A wave of regret hit me so hard it felt like a physical blow to the stomach. "What have you done?" The voice whispered in the dark. "You had a heated marble floor. You had a man who loved you. You are 40 years old, Sophia. You are sitting on a dirty floor in a room that smells like old onions and damp wood. You've had a psychotic break." I crawled into the sleeping bag and cried. Not the silent, polite tears of the Beige Period, but ugly, snot-dripping sobs that made my throat raw. I missed the smell of David's laundry detergent. I missed the safety of knowing exactly what would happen at 8:00 a.m. the next morning. I was terrified that I had traded a comfortable depression for a miserable reality. The first month was a lesson in humility. I realized very quickly that the VP of Marketing title meant nothing to a city that had 1,000,000 VPs, and even more people trying to be one. I was just another woman in a trench coat trying to figure out how the subway worked, while a line of impatient commuters hissed behind me. I had become soft in my porcelain fortress. I didn't know how to carry 4 bags of groceries up 4 flights of stairs without my heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't know how to negotiate with a landlord who only answered texts in cryptic emojis. I didn't know how to exist without a buffer between me and the world. The cold was the worst part. My investment coats, the ones I'd bought to look elegant while walking from a climate-controlled house to a climate-controlled car, were useless. They weren't meant for standing on a windswept subway platform for 20 minutes while the train delayed sign blinked mockingly. My skin turned a sickly gray. My hands were perpetually chapped, the knuckles cracking in the dry, heated air of the apartment. I remember one Tuesday, it's always Tuesdays. I was trying to find an office for a freelance job interview. It was pouring rain, that cold, slanted New York rain that finds its way under your umbrella and down your neck like a freezing finger. My GPS glitched, and I ended up walking 6 blocks in the wrong direction. By the time I realized it, my suede boots, another relic of my old life, were ruined, soaked through to the bone. I stood on a street corner in Midtown, water dripping off the tip of my nose, and I just stopped. I looked at the thousands of people rushing past me, none of them looking at me, none of them caring that I was Sophia from Willow Creek, that I was a success, that I was hurting. I felt smaller than I had ever felt in my life. I was a grain of sand on a beach of 8 million. And then, something strange happened. A man pushed past me, accidentally clipping my shoulder. "Watch it," he barked, not even turning around. In my old life, I would have apologized. I would have felt small and embarrassed. I would have gone home and wondered what I'd done wrong to deserve that tone. But that day, standing in the rain with ruined boots and a broken heart, a spark of pure, unadulterated rage flared up in my chest. "You watch it," I yelled back. My voice was loud. It was sharp. It was ugly. The man didn't stop, but I did. I stood there, breathing in the rain-soaked air, and I realized my heart was pounding. I wasn't floating above my body anymore. I wasn't in a fog. I was cold, I was wet, I was angry, and I was entirely present. The friction of the city was rubbing the numbness off my skin. New York was a giant whetstone, and I was being sharpened. I didn't get that job. I went home to my tiny, dark room and ate a bowl of cold noodles standing up in the kitchen because I still didn't have a table. I looked at the cockroaches that scurried under the baseboard when I turned on the light. In my old life, I would have been horrified. Now I just looked at them and thought, well, at least you're fighting to survive, too. I started to notice the details I had been too numb to see before. The way the light hit the brickwork of the old tenements at dusk, turning them the color of a burnt orange. The smell of the roasted nut carts on 42nd Street that smelled like a strange, urban Christmas. The sound of a cello player in the subway station whose music was so beautiful it made the commute feel like a prayer. I was broke. My mother still wouldn't return my calls, and when she did, she only talked about how much I'd hurt David. David had sent the divorce papers, and seeing his neat, architectural signature on the bottom made me feel like someone had punched me in the lungs. But when I walked down the street, I didn't feel like I was waiting for my life to be over. I felt like I was in the middle of a war, and for the first time, I was a soldier, not a spectator. The concrete shock was exactly what I needed. It was the smelling salts that woke me up from my 3-year coma. I was 40, I was a mess, and I was finally, painfully, starting to grow a new skin. By the 6th month, the city had stopped feeling like a battlefield and started feeling like a laboratory. I was no longer a visitor in Brooklyn. I was a resident. I knew which floorboard in my apartment to avoid so I wouldn't wake the baby downstairs. I knew that the guy at the bodega, Mo, would give me a free banana if I bought my coffee before 7:00 a.m. I was developing a map of a new self, one drawn in grit and determination rather than silk and marble. The healing didn't happen in a therapist's office with soft lighting, weighted blankets, and a box of premium tissues. It happened in a cramped, windowless office in East New York, working for a nonprofit that provided emergency housing and legal aid for runaway youth. I was the communications director, which was a fancy way of saying I wrote the newsletters, begged for donations, and sometimes helped scrub the floors after a radiator leak. My boss was a woman named Sarah. She was 55, with a voice like sandpaper and a laugh that sounded like a car engine struggling to start on a cold morning. She had lived in New York since 1982, and she carried the history of the city in the lines around her mouth and the permanent smudge of ink on her thumb. I remember one night in February. A pipe had burst in the shelter's basement, and the two of us were down there at 10:00 p.m., moving boxes of donated winter clothes to higher ground. I was sweating through my thrift store sweater. My hair was plastered to my forehead with a mixture of grime and humidity, and my hands were covered in gray, stagnant water. I stopped for a second, leaning against a damp brick wall that felt cold even through my clothes, and I started to laugh. It was a low, tired chuckle that vibrated in my chest. Sarah looked up from a crate of oversized puffer coats. "What's so funny, Princess?" she asked, using the nickname she gave me when she found out I used to have a VP title and a house with matching guest towels. "If my mother could see me right now," I said, gesturing to the murky water and the pile of soggy cardboard, "she'd think I'd reached the absolute lowest point of my life. She'd think I was a total failure. She'd probably try to check me into a clinic." Sarah wiped her brow with the back of a gloved hand, leaving a streak of soot across her forehead. She looked at me for a long beat, her eyes sharp and knowing. "Failure is a suburban word, Sophia. In this city, we just call it Tuesday. You think you're at the bottom because you're dirty and tired. Honey, you were at the bottom when you were sitting in that big house with nothing to do but count the cracks in your soul. You aren't failing. You're finally getting some calluses." She reached into her pocket, pulled out a crushed pack of cigarettes. She only smoked when things flooded or when the city council cut our budget, and handed me a box of damp clothes. "Move these, then go home and sleep. You look like hell, which means you're finally fitting in." That night, walking to the subway, the cold air felt sharp and clean. I realized she was right. Calluses, that's what I was building. In Willow Creek, my life was so cushioned that I had no friction, and without friction, there is no heat, no fire, no life. I had been soft for 40 years. I had been protected from the cold, from the noise, from the struggle, and it had nearly killed me. My soul had become a hothouse flower, beautiful to look at, but incapable of surviving a single night of frost. I started to embrace the ugly parts of my existence. I stopped trying to hide the gray hairs that were appearing at my temples. They were my stripes. I stopped wearing foundation to hide the lines around my eyes. Those lines were the record of my survival, the marks of a woman who had finally decided to stay awake. I began to find a different kind of beauty. It was in the way the sun set behind the industrial skeletons of the Brooklyn shipyards, turning the rusted cranes into golden statues. It was in the camaraderie of a packed subway car when everyone collectively sighed because of a signal delay, a shared moment of human frustration. It was in the raw, unfiltered honesty of the kids at the shelter who didn't give a damn about my pedigree or my career trajectory, but cared deeply if I actually looked them in the eye when they spoke. I also started to process the Beige Period with David. For the first time, I could look back at our marriage without just feeling a crushing weight of guilt. I realized that David wasn't a villain, and I wasn't a victim. We were just two people who had agreed to live in a beautiful, silent movie until I decided I couldn't handle the lack of sound anymore. I wrote him a letter, not a legal one, but a real one. I didn't ask for him to understand. I just apologized for the silence I had lived in for 3 years, and I thanked him for the kindness he tried to give me, even if it was a kindness that didn't fit the person I was becoming. He never wrote back, and that was okay. The healing wasn't about his forgiveness, it was about my own acknowledgement. By the time the first cherry blossoms started to bloom in Prospect Park, I realized I hadn't thought about ending it in months. The fog hadn't just lifted, it had been blown away by the exhaust of 1,000 city buses. I was 41 years old. I was single. I was making 40% of what I used to make. My investment, rug, was gone, replaced by a cheap woven mat I'd bought from a street fair in Bushwick. But when I woke up in the morning, I didn't feel that heavy, wet wool blanket on my soul. I felt the sharp, cool air from the window. I felt a hunger for the day. I felt the weight of my own body, solid and real on the mattress. I wasn't waiting for my life to be over anymore. I was waiting for the G train. I was waiting for the next grant to be approved. I was waiting for the sun to hit the brickwork. I had moved to New York after 3 years of depression to find a way to live. What I found was that living isn't a state of peace. It's a state of engagement. It's being willing to get your hands dirty in the basement of your own life to save the things that matter. It's been over a year since I traded my porcelain fortress for a 4th-floor walk-up. The city is currently shaking with the first signs of a humid New York summer, the kind where the air feels like a warm, wet towel, and the smell of the streets becomes a permanent, salty resident in your clothes. I'm sitting on my fire escape right now. It's my favorite place in the world. It's a rusted, skeletal structure that hangs over the alley, but from here, I can see the tops of the laundry lines, the flickering blue light of a neighbor's television, and a sliver of the bridge in the distance, glowing like a string of pearls. I'm 41 years old. I have $16 in my wallet and a stack of bills on my kitchen table that would have made the old Sophia pass out from a sheer panic attack. But I've never been more at peace with the mess. When I look back at those 3 years of the Beige Period, I don't see a tragedy anymore. I see a cocoon. That depression was my soul's way of shutting down a system that was no longer compatible with the truth. I used to think I was broken because I couldn't be happy in a perfect life. Now I realize that I wasn't broken. I was just misaligned. You can't put a wild animal in a velvet cage and expect it to be grateful for the premium kibble and the climate control. It's going to pace. It's going to lose its fur. It's going to stare at the lock until its eyes go dull and gray. To the women watching this, the ones who are currently sitting in their beautiful, quiet cars in their beautiful, quiet driveways, unable to find the strength to walk inside, I want to say something very clearly. You are not ungrateful. Society spends a lot of time telling women that once we reach 40, we should be settled. We should be the anchors. We should be content with the silence. But if that silence is screaming at you, listen to it. You aren't crazy for wanting friction. You aren't manic or selfish for wanting to feel the heat of your own life. Stability is a wonderful thing, but it's not a substitute for being alive. If you are smiling in the family photos while your hands are shaking beneath the table, please know that you don't have to stay there until the clock runs out. New York didn't fix me. I still have days where the gray fog tries to roll back in. I still have moments of intense, sharp loneliness where I miss the weight of David's arm across my waist at night, or the way the house smelled after the cleaning crew had been there. Moving didn't erase my past. It just gave me a bigger stage to play it out on. It gave me permission to be a work in progress. I think about that foundation bottle shattering on the marble floor every single day. I realize now that it was the best birthday present I ever received. That tiny shard of glass and that single, vivid bead of blood were the wake-up call I needed to stop being an investment and start being a human being. It reminded me that I could bleed, which meant I was still here. There is no fairy tale ending here. I didn't move to the city and find a handsome billionaire or land a job that made me a celebrity. I found a job that makes me tired and an apartment that makes me sweat. I found a life where I have to fight for my seat on the train and my place in the world. But when I walk down the street now, I don't feel like a ghost. I feel the wind. I feel the noise. I feel the push and pull of 8 million people all trying to survive, and I am so incredibly proud to be one of them. I moved to New York after 3 years of depression because I wanted to see if there was anything left of me under the silk and the porcelain. And it turns out there was a hell of a lot more than I thought. There was a woman who knew how to yell back, a woman who knew how to scrub floors, a woman who knew how to be alone without being empty. I have absolutely no regrets. Not for the house I left, not for the security I traded away, and certainly not for the woman I used to be. She did her best to keep me safe, but the woman I am now is the one who's actually living. I'm Sophia, I'm 41, and I'm finally, noisily, beautifully awake.